大家好，我是 Olive Branch Allen. So some of you guys who have been following this channel might know that we are a big proponent of low carbohydrate diets. And the reason why is because it has a lot to do with our blood sugar levels as well as our insulin levels. And so this video will all be about glycemic index and how that impacts your health and what we need to focus on and not focus on. In this video, I'm going to explain to you what is the glycemic index, or the GI for short, how is it measured, why is it not that useful, and what is a more useful index that you should be following. So simply put, the GI is basically just an understanding of a list of foods and a rating. The rating tells you how much your blood sugar increases after you've eaten it and how long it tails off in a 2-hour window. So as the title suggests, why GI is not useful is because it's actually based on how it's measured. So basically, when they measure GI for a certain food type, what they do is they take a participant and they subject them to 50 grams of pure glucose. This is a baseline. They do this for all the tests. So 50 grams of glucose, they cause a blood sugar rise in the subject, and then it drops down over time as it metabolizes. Then they give the test subject, after the next day, a test food, for example, a carrot. And then they have to give them, again, 50 grams of carbohydrates of carrots so that that blood sugar rises again and then drops over a 2-hour window. And it measures the difference between pure glucose and carrots. And that is the GI for that food type. Now, when they do that for 10 test subjects, the GI can actually affect each person very differently. That's why they do 10 people, and then they take the average of all 10 people, and that is the GI. So it's very specific per lab test. So the GI actually does fluctuate depending on the test. Now, the problem with this measuring system is that when you take 50 grams of carbohydrate of a certain type of food, that type of food can actually have fiber in there as well. And so when you're taking 50 grams of available carbohydrates to do the test, well, you actually have to subtract out the fiber first. And so if it's a fibrous food item like carrots, then you actually have to consume more carrots in order to meet the 50-gram requirement to do the test. This means that you might be eating 2 pounds worth of carrots before you have 50 grams of available carbohydrates for your body to absorb and then to compare with the 50 grams of glucose. What this means is that it is no longer a realistic measurement for normal people, as we don't normally sit for a meal and eat 2 pounds of carrots. That's just too many carrots. You get too full. So this is why, although the GI is interesting to see how it compares to glucose, what you need to understand is the portion size. And this is the main difference why the glycemic index is not actually that useful. So just to give you an example, a very rough example, the numbers are not exact, but eating 3 slices of white bread may give you 50 grams of carbohydrates. Now compare that with carrots again, which you might need 2 pounds of carrots to give you 50 grams of carbohydrates, because again, you need to subtract out the fiber. And as we all know, there's a lot of fiber in carrots. Therefore, eating 3 slices of bread might seem realistic, at least for some people, to consume, whereas eating 2 pounds of carrots, which is a lot of carrots, is unrealistic and nobody will eat that much. So you can't really compare the GI value of white bread with the GI value of carrots because it's just misleading. The other thing that makes GI misleading is that you can actually change the GI value of certain foods once you cook it more or cook it less. How you prepare it will change it drastically. Or how it combines with other food types will make the carbohydrates in the food more bioavailable, meaning more readily absorbable, or not. So again, there's all these different combinations of factors that can affect your GI, which is why if you just look at the GI, it's misleading. As I mentioned earlier, when they measure the GI of a certain food, they take 10 test subjects, and then they take the average of it. And that's because there's individuality. So everyone actually processes carbohydrates a little differently. So their blood sugar level will spike differently, even though it's the exact type of food, exact amount of food, but just differences in genetics. And so this actually also has an impact on your blood sugar level response. So now that we understand that the GI is flawed because of the serving size can be miscalculated, glycemic load is actually another index that you may have heard of that's a little bit more accurate, because that actually takes into account what is the glycemic index within a normal serving size. And so the glycemic load is the glycemic index, but it also considers the serving size. So however, the problem with glycemic load is that it still uses the glycemic index as its reference. So if the glycemic index is flawed based on cooking preparation or individuality, the glycemic load, although is a better measurement than the glycemic index, it is still flawed based on these points. The other thing you want to consider is that fructose does not get represented very well in the GI. That's because fructose doesn't raise blood sugar levels as much as glucose does. And so a lot of food that has high in fructose might actually be considered as low GI. So if we look into the examples of some food, let's say fruit, mangoes, about 50 GI is what's registered for one single serving size of mango. That translates to about 15 grams of fructose. Now, if you look in watermelon, the watermelon's GI for the same serving size is 70 on the GI scale. However, the fructose is only 5 grams. So the fructose difference is about 3 times different. However, the GI says the opposite. This is another example why the GI can be misleading because it completely discounts the amount of fructose. Lastly, after all the science that I just talked about, GI and GL, there were actually more studies that were done on a high GI diet versus a low GI diet on a population, and they want to measure the cardiovascular risk markers, indicators, such as blood pressure, blood cholesterol, and what they found out was that the high GI is the same as the low GI. In other words, when they're just looking at pure GI as a number, it doesn't really affect the overall health of the participants. And so this is why, guys, out of all the videos I've talked about being healthy, having a low carb diet, why insulin, blood sugar is not good for you, I never once talked about the glycemic index, and that's because it is just very misleading. And hopefully this video helps to explain why that is, and why if you really just want to simplify healthy eating, then I would just basically look at lowering the amount of carbohydrates in general that you should be eating. However, if you're eating carbohydrates, distinguish whether it's a high fiber carb or a low fiber carb, because you always want to eat foods or carbs that are higher on the fiber side. So that's it, guys. I hope you found that useful. Again, I am not a doctor, so if you're diabetic or if you know someone who's diabetic, please don't just forward them this video. Instead, have them listen to their physician. Okay, this is informational purposes only, but I do hope you found that useful, and leave any questions or comments below, and I'll see you next time.